Resonance. A Plague Tale legacy seems to stem from a very clear desire not to make simply another A Plague Tale. After 2 games centered on Amicia, Hugo, Stealth, and Rats, the developer decided to go back in time, switch protagonists, and significantly alter how the player interacts with the world. To me, this conveys the sense of a studio looking to keep exploring the franchise without remaining trapped in the formula audiences already know. The choice of Sophia feels particularly important in this context. Since she already appeared in Requiem, Asobo isn't introducing a character completely detached from the franchise. Yet they don't need to replicate the emotional dynamic of previous titles either. This gives the studio room to build an adventure with a distinct personality. From the little that has been shown, Sophia appears to have been designed to justify faster, more physical gameplay that is perhaps less dependent on the constant sense of fragility defining Amicia. I also view this gameplay shift as a considerable risk. The series made a name for itself precisely by creating tension through vulnerability, silence, and the necessity of avoiding confrontation. Now, the protagonist seems far better equipped to fight and navigate environments. My question is whether Asobo can preserve the identity of A Plague Tale when the player is given more resources and freedom. So far, it looks like an interesting attempt, but it remains unclear whether these new mechanics emerged organically from the narrative or were chosen primarily to make the title more commercially appealing. The Minotaur Island setting reinforces this impression of change. Instead of continuing to explore solely the historical European backdrop of earlier chapters, the studio is steering the series toward a setting rooted in mythology, ruins, and a tone closer to an archaeological adventure. I like the idea because it could prevent the franchise from becoming repetitive, though there is also the danger of drifting too far from what made the first 2 entries special. Asobo seems to be attempting a balance between historical drama, fantasy, and action-adventure, and this balance will likely prove to be one of the trickiest aspects of development. The technical side also stands out, mainly because the studio continues working with proprietary technology. This reflects a team that wants full control over its visual direction and game systems, rather than relying strictly on off-the-shelf solutions. At the same time, using proprietary tech raises the stakes for the studio. The greater the visual ambition and the number of interconnected systems, the higher the expectations for the game to arrive well-optimized and free of technical issues. Another element that catches my attention is the franchise's timing. Requiem concluded in a very definitive and emotional manner, making a direct continuation of the main storyline a complicated endeavor. Developing a prequel seems like a smart solution, as it expands the universe without undermining the weight of the previous ending. In my view, this shows that Asobo understands that not every sequel needs to move forward chronologically. The studio can utilize the past to introduce new stories, characters, and conflicts while preserving the closure it already achieved. Overall, I see Resonance, A Plague Tale Legacy, as a transitional project. It does not look like a mere sequel, nor does it seem to discard the series' legacy entirely. Asobo is testing how far it can push this universe by altering the protagonist, pacing, combat, and setting. Personally, I find it more interesting to see a developer take this kind of risk, rather than strictly repeating the previous formula. Though I maintain some caution. Based on the revealed material, the title looks promising as an evolution, but it still needs to prove that its changes establish a distinct identity, rather than just a collection of new features layered over the A Plague Tale name. From what has been shown so far, Resonance largely trades the stealth of earlier titles for gameplay much more focused on direct combat. I'm quickly pausing the video to share a quick tip. If you have your eye on Resonance, A Plague Tale Legacy, the PC version is at a really good pre-order price on Instant Gaming. So before buying from traditional stores, it's worth checking it out and comparing the price. And just a reminder that Instant Gaming isn't a marketplace. You buy directly from the store without relying on third-party sellers. Plus, if you decide to pick up the game, using my affiliate link in the description would be greatly appreciated. It doesn't cost you anything extra and directly supports the channel. But of course, don't buy it just for that reason. Only use the link if you are already planning on picking it up. Now let's jump back into the video and see if Resonance, A Plague Tale Legacy truly lives up to all the hype. Sophia wields a sword and dagger, capable of attacking, blocking, dodging, and parrying strikes, giving the game an identity quite distinct from the experience with Amicia. To me, this change makes sense because the protagonist is presented as more experienced and prepared for direct danger, though it completely shifts the series' core tension. Combat appears easy to grasp, yet not necessarily shallow. The player can execute standard attacks, charge a critical strike with the dagger, break enemy guard with a kick, and time dodges or parries accurately. Defense seems to sit at the core of the system, as parrying consecutive attacks can leave opponents open to heavier blows. I like this design because it seems to rely more on observing the enemy than merely mashing the attack button. The inclusion of a parry also caught my eye because, based on what has been shared, it does not seem to turn the title into a Souls-like. Previews indicate that timing windows are relatively forgiving, aiming to deliver a sense of skill without requiring extreme precision at all times. Personally, I consider this a solid choice that fits a cinematic adventure. The player needs to pay attention without getting bogged down in punishing, drawn-out encounters. The grappling hook mechanic is one of the additions that most piqued my curiosity. Sophia can pull distant foes closer, disrupt threats positioned on high ground, and create openings for critical strikes. It is a tool that looks to make encounters more dynamic, though there is a risk of it becoming overpowered and trivializing encounters that should require deeper strategy. If the game balances its usage effectively, the hook could become one of the standout elements of the gameplay loop. I also like the idea that not all enemies can be tackled the same way. Some can have their guard broken with kicks, others may demand flank attacks, while larger adversaries cannot simply be parried or stunned. This variety could keep combat from turning automatic. Still, since fights seem to take place in structured arenas or designated areas, enemy behavior variety will be essential to prevent skirmishes from devolving into the same repeated sequence in every room. Exploration appears to serve as a direct companion to the action. Previews mention environments split between combat zones, puzzles, and optional pickups, alongside swords with distinct perks, accessories, and skill upgrade points. I appreciate this approach because it offers a degree of customization without turning the title into an over-engineered RPG. The question is whether these rewards genuinely incentivize exploration or simply act as predictable bonuses scattered along the path. Overall, the revealed gameplay strikes me as a bold step and, so far, more convincing than I anticipated. The combat does not appear to reinvent the genre, but it integrates attack, defense, parrying, grappling, and executions in a way that could keep engagements fluid and satisfying. My main concern is whether the series will lose its signature stealth suspense entirely and slip into repetitive combat encounters, though Sophia's low durability and the need to react properly to enemy tells should retain some of that tension. If Asobo manages to balance action, exploration, and puzzles, this shift could stand as a natural evolution, rather than just an effort to turn A Plague Tale into a pure action combat title. What we know so far is that Resonance's story follows Sophia 15 years prior to Requiem, back when she was still involved with a band of looters and fleeing the Venetian army. The journey begins as a personal search for answers regarding her own past, but quickly leads the character to the Minotaur Island, a place steeped in myth, ruins, and secrets tied to the macula. This premise alone points toward an adventure leaning more into mystery and discovery than the familial tragedy of previous games. What interests me most is that Sophia isn't simply traveling to the island out of curiosity. The information released suggests she is plagued by visions tied to the Minotaur, and that an intimate connection exists between these visions and the history of the macula. This provides an internal drive for the protagonist. She isn't merely trying to survive or protect someone, but attempting to understand why that myth seems directly connected to her own existence. The presence of Lenny may also prove crucial in preventing the narrative from becoming a purely solitary investigation. Sophia is accompanied by a young protege while attempting to escape the fallout from the destruction of her former crew. I like this dynamic because it allows the narrative to explore not just the character's past, but also the kind of person she has become and the responsibilities she now shoulders. The relationship between the two can serve to highlight Sophia's more grounded, human side, centering the narrative on the Minotaur as both compelling and risky. In previous installments, the macula was tied to a supernatural threat grounded within a concrete historical setting. Now the developer appears to be aligning this concept with much more overt mythology, featuring a legendary creature, a mysterious island, and a labyrinth tied to Daedalus. Personally, I find this expansion interesting, though I hope the myth isn't treated as a merely literal, surface-level explanation for every mystery. The possibility of the plot connecting distinct eras also caught my attention. The released material mentions a link between Sophia's medieval journey and events from a much older era tied to the origins of the island and the macula. This structure could add substantial depth to the narrative by elevating the story beyond a simple character origin. On the other hand, nonlinear timelines require precise handling to avoid becoming muddled or overly expository. Another promising aspect is how Sophia's past appears tied to her family history and the violent experiences that shaped her character. This gives her a trajectory distinct from Amisha's, while still preserving a core series theme. ordinary people altered by historical and supernatural forces beyond their control. The difference is that Sophia starts the journey already hardened, meaning the focus will likely dwell less on witnessing her unraveling and more on understanding how she became that person. Overall, Resonance's revealed narrative makes me curious because it seeks to broaden the A Plague Tale universe without directly continuing Amicia and Hugo's arc. Sophia's search for her past, the connection to Minotaur Island, and the ancient roots of the macula form a premise with solid potential. My only concern is that the writing might lean too heavily into explaining myth and destiny, potentially losing the intimacy of earlier games. Even so, looking strictly at what has been presented, I consider it an interesting direction. Asobo appears to be using a fresh protagonist and a new period to explore the foundations of the franchise without merely repeating the same narrative beats. The game showcases graphics heavily focused on atmosphere. The developer seems to use lighting not just to make environments visually appealing, but to establish contrast between safety, mystery, and danger. In the release trailers and screenshots, torches, light shafts, ruins, and darkened areas help build a strong visual identity for the adventure. Personally, I appreciated how light serves as an integral part of the environmental composition. Minotaur Island is depicted with temples, ancient corridors, caverns, and weathered structures, all gaining distinct character through shadows and illumination effects. Rather than relying solely on sweeping panoramic vistas, the game seems intent on crafting beauty out of enclosed, claustrophobic spaces rich with history. Visually, the game also appears to step away somewhat from the heavier, more somber palette of A Plague Tale Requiem. Grime, violence, and decay remain, but the shown environments carry a sunnier, more exotic presence, marked by warm tones, weathered masonry, and foliage overgrowing the ruins. Personally, I found this shift compelling because it fits the premise of exploring a mysterious island without entirely stripping away the franchise's darker edge. The environments look to be the primary graphical highlight so far. The Minoan-inspired ruins carry enough detail to convey the sense of an ancient civilization behind the architecture, rather than merely a sequence of hallways designed to shuttle the player between cutscenes. It remains to be seen whether this level of quality persists across all areas, but the shown segments indicate careful attention to architecture, composition, and scale. Light-based effects may also stand as one of the game's key visual differentiators. Sophia utilizes a sphere capable of emitting different colors, and light beams appear to interact directly with environmental objects and structures. This yields striking visual moments in the trailers, particularly when light reveals hidden paths, activates mechanisms, or transforms the entire look of a room. I appreciate when a visual mechanic serves a functional purpose, as it moves beyond pure decoration and becomes part of the game's graphical identity. At the same time, certain visual effects risk overshadowing character models. Volumetric fog, particle density, harsh shadows, and reflections are heavily featured throughout the promotional material. In some instances, this intensity works well. In others, there is a risk of visual clutter or obscuring critical detail. Given the game's reliance on light and shadow contrast, balancing fidelity and visual readability will be essential. The graphical presentation stands among the most convincing elements so far. It is not merely a matter of raw resolution, texture quality, or detail density. The game displays a distinct visual direction centered around ancient ruins, dramatic lighting, and the contrast between the natural and supernatural. My only reservation is that promotional trailers naturally highlight the most polished areas, so observing how the presentation holds up across the full campaign will be key. Based on what has been shown, however, Asobo seems to be crafting a visually atmospheric experience with an aesthetic that leans further into adventure than previous installments. Based on what has been confirmed, the game will feature dedicated graphical modes. On PS5 and Xbox Series X, the title offers a quality mode at 30 frames per second, targeting resolution and advanced visual effects, alongside a performance mode at 60 frames per second that scales back graphical settings in favor of frame rate fluidity. To me, this setup makes complete sense, particularly because the new gameplay depends heavily on dodges, parries, and responsive combat. On PS5 Pro, the scenario is more notable. The console provides an enhanced performance mode, maintaining the 60 frames per second target while preserving higher-tier visual features, including ray tracing, whereas the base PS5 requires greater concessions in these areas. On paper, this positions the PS5 Pro as the visually complete console version. Even so, I wouldn't automatically opt for quality mode purely for resolution, as smooth frame delivery aligns much better with Sophia's combat mechanics. On Xbox Series S, technical concessions are more expected. The console will also feature quality and performance options, but with cutbacks to resolution, shadow quality, draw distances, and specific visual effects compared to Series X and PS5. This isn't inherently an issue, as the Series S was designed around tighter hardware limits. The critical factor will be whether the build sustains a stable 30 or 60 frames per second without degrading environmental readability. Offering a 60 frames per second mode on current-gen consoles represents an important step forward compared to Requiem's original launch. At release, that title was capped at 30 frames per second before receiving a post-launch performance patch on PS5 and Xbox Series X. With Resonance introducing more direct combat and higher mobility, delivering a 60 frames per second option on day one indicates greater focus on input responsiveness and player control during combat. On PC, the published system requirements also point toward a balanced performance profile. The minimum specifications target 1080p at 30 frames per second on low settings, while the recommended tier utilizes an RTX 3060 Ti or RX 6700 XT to target 1080p at 60 frames per second on Ultra without requiring upscaling or frame generation. This leaves a positive impression, suggesting the game does not demand high-end hardware to achieve a fluid Full HD experience. My main concern remains performance stability, particularly in sequences featuring heavy lighting, dense particle effects, numerous enemies, and open areas. A performance mode is only effective if it holds a consistent frame rate, rather than simply hitting 60 frames per second in less demanding rooms. On Series S, this stability will require close scrutiny, whereas on PS5 Pro, the added overhead should help smooth out drops and retain graphical fidelity without compromising fluidity. Overall, Resonance's performance strategy appears well-structured, offering clear options tailored to different hardware tiers. The PS5 and Xbox Series X should satisfy players choosing between visual fidelity and 60 frames per second. The Series S serves as the more technically compromised option, and the PS5 Pro positions itself as the premier console build, pairing high performance with advanced effects. My preference leans toward performance mode, as the updated combat loop benefits directly from lower input latency. Provided these modes run reliably at launch, Asobo has the opportunity to address one of the primary technical hurdles associated with the previous entry. I believe Resonance, A Plague Tale Legacy presents solid arguments for a day one purchase, particularly for players who enjoy third-person narrative adventures and are open to a significant shift in the series' formula. The design combines a new protagonist, expanded combat mechanics, exploration, puzzles, and a mythological setting tied to the established A Plague Tale lore. It does not read like a safe, repetitive follow-up, but rather an effort to take the franchise in a fresh direction. I would specifically recommend the game to those who appreciated the world-building, atmosphere, and narrative depth of earlier entries, without requiring Resonance to replicate Amicia and Hugo's journey beat for beat. The new adventure follows Sophia and Lenny across a Mediterranean island filled with ruins, artifacts, lore mysteries, and pacing reminiscent of adventures like Uncharted or Indiana Jones. For players aligned with that style, an early purchase makes sense, as the project looks to deliver a substantial expansion of the universe rather than a low-stakes side story. I would also recommend it to players who prefer focused, linear single-player campaigns that emphasize cinematic presentation. Based on the material shown, Resonance does not attempt to be a massive open-world RPG laden with checklist filler. The design appears focused on a tight campaign featuring action beats, environmental traversal, and discovery. For those who value this format and typically finish 10 to 20-hour campaigns, the launch price point feels reasonable. The primary caveat applies to players expecting another title structured almost entirely around stealth. Sophia is far more capable in open combat, and the revealed gameplay places direct fighting, exploration, and puzzles at the forefront. I wouldn't classify this as a flaw, but rather a design shift that buyers need to account for beforehand. Anyone who considers pure stealth the non-negotiable core of A Plague Tale may want to wait for comprehensive reviews to assess whether the combat mechanics carry the full campaign. At full price, the value proposition also varies by platform. The game is listed around $49.99 on Steam and $59.99 on consoles, though regional pricing and store policies may vary. On PS5, without Game Pass availability, a day one purchase becomes a straightforward choice for dedicated series followers who like what has been shown. On PC and Xbox, Game Pass inclusion significantly reduces the necessity of a direct purchase, though the standalone release still appears to offer enough content to warrant an outright buy for core fans. I would exercise more caution in recommending an immediate purchase to newcomers or those mildly curious purely from promotional footage. While the new direction may be accessible, questions remain regarding narrative pacing, combat depth over time, overall length, and multi-platform stability. For that audience, waiting a few days for detailed reviews and spoiler-free gameplay impressions is the more measured route. Not because the title looks subpar, but because mechanical changes of this scale tend to divide opinions. In my view, weighing everything showcased so far, the title makes a strong case for a launch purchase, provided players understand they are stepping into an action-adventure evolution of A Plague Tale. The setting, protagonist, island exploration, and expanded mythos generate genuine interest, and the scope of the project feels ambitious enough to warrant day-one support. I would only advise holding off if your primary expectation is an exact structural replica of Innocence and Requiem. Otherwise, Resonance stands as a compelling entry with solid potential to justify the initial investment.